Hi everyone, PV here, and welcome to my new YouTube video. And in this week's video, we're going to talk about something a little bit different than we usually talk about, and that is the top 10 players of all time. So of all the players that have ever played Magic, these are, in my opinion, the 10 best. And this is something that is not immediately actionable. You know, you're not going to watch this video and immediately go and win your PTQ or something like that. But I still think it's something that's interesting to talk about, and we can learn a little bit as we understand why these players are the best 10 players who have ever played the game. And what metric am I going to use to decide who the top 10 players of all time are? Well, there's not going to be one specific metric, right? I could, for example, take top 10 players of all time in terms of pro points, top 10 pro point earners. I think that would be a reasonable metric to use. I could use top 10 players of all time in terms of PT top 8s. I could use top 10 win rates of all time and just copy that and have that be my list, right? I could do that. But if I were to do that, there would be no point in doing this video to begin with, right? You can just go to Magic Wiki and find out this information for yourself. So my criteria is going to be a little bit more subjective than that. Obviously, results are important. They're extremely important. They're the most important thing in this conversation, but they're not everything. Because especially as we go, outside of the top 5, the results start to muddle a little bit. Player number 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 have very, very similar results. So we can't just go by results to decide who the best players are. And then there's also the question of how you compare old results with new results, right? Because Magic is a very different game now than it was 20 years ago. So what if someone had 5 top 8s 20 years ago and someone has 5 top 8s now? Is that the same? Are they equally good? Is it equally impressive? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, the new tournaments have more value than the old tournaments because they're harder. Because the competition is much, much stronger. There's the internet, information spreads very, very quickly, and no one is bad. No one shows up to a Pro Tour with a bad deck. No one is a bad player in a Pro Tour. Everyone is better, and everyone has at least a reasonable deck. So it used to be that you'd go to the Pro Tour, and then you'd find some people playing green-red spiders, unsleeved with 68 cards. And some people were playing Tolarian Academy that kill you on turn 2. Right? This is an exaggeration, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. There's some kernel of truth in there. So it used to be that some people would just have extremely better decks than the opposition. The average player was very, very bad back then. And this doesn't take anything away from the people who did well, right? They were much better than their competition, which is why they won a lot more back then. But it does mean that I'm more impressed by someone who wins a lot right now than I was by someone who won a lot back then, right? I think they are not of 5 top 8s now and 5 top 8s before are not of exactly equal value if you were judging results. But if we're not going to go by any single metric to decide this top 10, what are we going to use to figure out who belongs in it? Well, my opinion, right? It's going to be a mix of results and my opinion about these players. I feel like over my, almost 2 decades of professional Magic, I've interacted with all of these players in one way or another, right? There are some players I'm close friends with. I know a lot about their strengths and weaknesses. And there are some players that I've just played against a couple times, but I have interacted in a professional capacity with all of the players on this list. I have played against literally all of them. And I've also played against anyone who's a contender for the list. So I've played against this 10, but also against 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, right? I've played against anyone you could reasonably include in a list like this. So I have a pretty good idea of who I consider to be better or worse, right? So this list is going to be that. It's going to be an amalgamation of results, which are obviously important, but also my opinions about these players. Who am I most impressed about? Who do I least want to face in a game of Magic? These are all things that matter when composing this list. In 10th place in my list, I have Shuhei. So Shuhei is a player from Japan who has 5 PT top 8s with 2 wins and 23 GP top 8s with 1 win. And I think these results, while obviously very impressive, anyone in this list is going to have impressive results, that's a requirement, are not a top 10 of all time result. Right? There are people who are not on this list who have better results than he does. But he still makes the list because of this subjective criteria that we talked about. Because I have played against Shuhei many, many times. And I think he's just extremely good, extremely talented. He is just an incredible, incredible player. To give you an idea of how much I value Shuhei's abilities, last year I wrote an article for StarCityGames.com where I ranked the top 5 players currently playing the game, so as of last year. And I put Shuhei first. So I thought Shuhei was the best player in the world at the time I wrote that article last year. And this is because whenever I play against him, he impresses me. He always is a step ahead of everyone and of me when we play as well. I feel like he reads my mind every time that we play. he just does it so extremely quickly. It's actually very, very impressive. If you watch any of his matches, in real life Magic, he's the fastest player in the world. I think I don't think there's anyone that's as fast as him and that plays as well as he does. So if we had any sort of rapid Magic, like you have rapid chess or fast Magic or anything like that, he would probably be the world champion in that, because his thought process happens very, very quickly. And he will do something and you'll be like, wait, why did he do that? That didn't make any sense. And then 2 minutes later it'll dawn on you, like, oh, that's why he did it. But it took me 2 minutes to figure it out. It took him 2 seconds, right? So he is just extremely talented. I think the normal community, didn't pay attention to him as much as they should, because he's from Japan. He doesn't speak a lot of English, so he's not, in social media as much. If you're not a Japanese player, he doesn't do interviews and stuff like that. But the professional community has always thought he's one of the very best players. Everyone I've ever talked to that has played against him has a very, very high opinion of him, which is why I think he belongs on this list. If anything, he doesn't belong even higher because he has one weakness, I think, and his weakness is deck selection. Because a lot of the top players, no one will play the perfect deck every time. But some players never play a bad deck, or almost never play a bad deck. Even if you just decide to play a stock tier 1 deck, that's already good enough, right? You aren't playing a bad deck. But Shota feels like he goes out of his way to play bad decks sometimes. He just focuses too much on playing control, the Grixis control, or Esper control, or Blue-Black control, or Jeskai control. He just always plays the same deck, regardless of whether it's good or bad. And I feel like this is a handicap, right? He doesn't win as much as he should, based on how good it is, because he doesn't choose the right decks. But that is a thing we have to consider, and that is the reason he's 10th and not even higher on the list. But still, an extremely impressive player that I'm honestly a huge, huge fan of Shota, and definitely belongs in this list for me. In 9th place on my list, I have Musashi Oizo. Musashi Oizo is another player from Japan who has 6 PT top 8s and 10 Grand Prix top 8s with 1 win. He also has a Team World win, so he's a Team World champion as well. And Musashi Oizo might be the name that you're least familiar with on this list, at least if you haven't been playing for a very long time. Because of everyone on this list, he's the only player that actively stopped playing. So you haven't seen Musashi play a tournament in, I think, over 10 years. Right, but when he played, he was extremely dominant. Everyone who played at the time spoke about how good Musashi Oizo was. He was sort of the first Japanese player to break through. I think I remember this story that, Japanese players were good, but the Americans dominated everything a while ago. Like a long time ago, the US was the undisputed champion of Magic, and there was a period of time where the Japanese players started competing in international events, and then Japanese players won everything. We had 5 years in a row with Japanese players as players of the year. And Musashi Oizo was, to my understanding, the person that started this trend. That first went to a foreign tournament to play competitively, and then just took all the Japanese players with him. So the Japanese community and the Magic community owes part of that to Musashi Oizo specifically. He was the first breakout player from Japan. And as for his strengths and weaknesses, I have to admit that I'm also not as familiar with them as I am with the other players, because of the players on this list, he's the one I know the least. Because when I started becoming a good player was when he started leaving the professional scene. But even then, I have had the chance to play against him a couple times, and he was always extremely impressive. I remember I played him in the Fairies Mirror in a World Championship, and I was already good back then. I played Fairies. This was my best deck of all the decks. And he played better than me. He taught me lines of play in that matchup that I was not really familiar with, and it was very eye-opening. So I have no doubt that had he continued playing, you'd know who he is. But because he didn't continue playing, you might not know. But I still think he belongs in my top 10 just because of how extremely good he was, even if it wasn't for as long a period of time as the other players on the list. In 8th place on my list comes Seth Manfield. Seth Manfield is a player from the United States who has 6 PT top 8s with 1 win and 17 GP top 8s with 5 wins. But he also has a Mythic Invitational win that happened last year. It was an online tournament, but it was basically the equivalent of a PT, and also a World Championship win. So Seth has effectively 3 top level finishes, if you're going to count on that, and I do. I think they're the equivalent finishes to a PT top 8, basically. So Seth has very, very good finishes, and he has been one of the best players in the world for a very long time. I think anyone who's a professional player, who has been a professional player in the past 5 or 10 years, will name Seth as one of the most fearsome opponents that they can play against. And again, obviously everyone on this list is extremely good. They all have a lot of strengths and very few weaknesses. But I think Seth's particular strength compared to the other players on this list is how good he is at mind games. Whenever I play against Seth, I always have the impression that he's considering what I'm thinking at all times. A lot of people, even very, very good players, only think about what they're thinking. They make the best plays based on the information they have. They don't think about what information they are conveying by making a certain play. And Seth does. I feel like Seth's plays are all taking into account what information he's conveying and what the opponent is going to think. So he often makes plays that, wouldn't make any sense if you're just looking at his side of the battlefield, but will make a lot of sense if you start considering what kind of information this particular place gives the opponent. So maybe, I wouldn't attack because I think attacking is bad, but Seth does attack because he understands that by attacking, he's conveying certain information that he wants the opponent to believe. So he's very, very good at that. He's very good at understanding the consequences of his actions into his opponent's thought process. This is my perceived best strength of him. But, definitely a player that is very complete, I think, and pretty good at every aspect of the game. In 7th place on my list, I have Kenji. Kenji is a player from Japan who has 6 PT top 8s and 13 GP top 8s with 2 wins, and he also has a Player of the Year title, which sets him a little bit apart. But what sets him apart the most is the perception that, at his peak, he was the best player playing the game at that point. So that's a really hard thing to do, right? Not many people get to be the best player of their time, but Kenji was, I would say, not the consensus, but widely considered to be the best player playing the game when he was fully dedicated to the game. After that, he took certain breaks and, he stopped going to tournaments, but he does play in tournaments from time to time. He's still an active player. He creates content in Japanese. And he, in fact, even won a championship to qualify for the Kalheim Championship. So he won a qualifier. He's going to compete in this event in a month, and it's going to be very exciting to see him competing at the highest level another time. And my favorite story about Kenji is probably his path to self-improvement in Limited specifically. Because at his peak, Kenji was, I think, again, widely considered the best constructed player in the world, but not the best limited player. He was much worse in limited than he was in constructed. Obviously not bad in limited, but he was, number 1 in constructed and number 500 in limited, right? So he decided that he wasn't happy with 500. He wanted to be number 1 and number 1. So he went after people who he considered to be very good limited players and just got them to teach him. He talked to them and he learned a lot from them. He had some sort of mentorship with Rich Hohen that I know of. And he became a good limited player as well. In fact, he top 8'd the very next limited pro tour. Back then we had all limited pro tours, and he top 8'd one of those, which was, this big accomplishment and this big story for someone who was not considered to be a good limited player. So even though he was already considered by many the best player in the world, he knew he had something to improve on, and he went after that, and he did improve on it and became an even better player. So I have a lot of admiration for that. He's also an extremely nice person. Everyone loves Kenji. Obviously, that's not why he's on his list, but it is worth mentioning that he's just a very, very happy person, and that is very contagious a lot of the time. In 6th place, we have Shuhei Nakamura. Shuhei was also a Japanese player and has 6 PT top 8s and 27 GP top 8s with open 7 wins. He's also 2nd of all time in professional points, in pro points. And I honestly believe Shuhei has played more professional level events than everyone else. He's played so many Grand Prixes and so many PTs. He's really been around forever and has been a fixture of the professional Magic scene for a very long time. And of course, he's extremely good. He won Player of the Year one year in the golden age of Japanese Magic, so to speak. He was one of the Japanese players that won Player of the Year in that stretch that was dominated by Japan. But his career is a little bit different than the other Japanese players because he's a more consistent player. Players like Musashi and Kenji, I feel like they had, this very bright moment, and then they kind of disappeared. And Shuhei wasn't like that. Shuhei was never considered the best player in the world at any point. Like, no one thought Shuhei was the best player in the world, but he was always there, in the top 5, in the top 10 for a very long time. So he has longevity, he has consistency, and obviously he has ability. And I think the thing that impresses me the most about Shuhei is how he manages to extract value from bad cards. And this seems like a little bit of a joke, but it isn't. He's actually the best player that I've ever seen at playing with bad cards. I've played, especially in limited, right? When you don't choose what you play. In constructed, ideally you're not playing any bad cards, but this manifests a lot in limited when sometimes you're forced to play cards that you don't want to, and he's just extremely good at extracting value from this card. He's very patient. He always sets up this exact moment to trick you and to trap you into doing exactly what he wants. I've played some team events with Shuhei, team limited, and every single time we would be like, okay, we have these two good decks and this awful deck. We're gonna give Shuhei the awful deck because he's so good at awful decks, and then he would just go like 12-2 with an unplayable deck. Right? He consistently does this. It's not a coincidence. He's legitimately very good at extracting value from bad situations and bad cards. He sets up everything extremely well. This is, I think, his biggest skill and the thing he's best in the world at. But even if it wasn't for that, he deserves to be in this top 10, I think, just because of how consistently good he was for such a long period of time. In 5th place on my list is Gabriel Nasif. Nasif is a French player with 12 Petit Top 8s and 2 wins, and 7 GP Top 8s and 1 win, but he also has a lot of results in the recent online tournaments. So he's been crushing the online tournaments, has several Top 8s in the span of a year, and I would argue that out of everyone, he probably had the best year last year. So he was the most accomplished Magic player in this 1.5 year span that we've been forced to move to online Magic because of COVID. That's not something that he needed. I think I already had Nasif in my top 5 before, just based on his past career. It is strong enough to land him this on the top 5 players of all time, but it is very impressive that a player like him, who had so much success before, managed to come back and have success again. I think Nasif's style is very similar to mine, actually, in that he has very high highs and very low lows. So some players are just extremely consistent, like a player like Shuhei, for example, that I just talked about. He'll almost never make a flat-out mistake. He'll never tap the wrong land, attack with the wrong creature. He might not make brilliant plays from time to time, but he's not gonna make any stupid errors either. And Nasif is not like that. Nasif makes brilliant plays and also stupid errors. He wins games that only Nasif would win and loses games that only Nasif would lose, which is sort of like how I am as well. So it's a very similar play style to mine, if you can call it a play style. It's a very similar, skill set as mine. But the thing that sets him apart from the players in this list is his deck building skills. Right now, deck building is a tricky thing because there's so much information out there and it's hard to credit a deck to any single person at any point. All the decks are just found before the format is even started being played. You have the release event, before the set's even out, there are already decks being formed. So it's very hard to pinpoint who the best deck builders are. But back then, it wasn't the case. Back then, you had legitimately people who were considered the best deck builders in the game. And Nasif was one of those. I remember I followed his career before I became a pro player myself, and I was always very impressed at his decks. So I think it's something that he has that no one else in this top 10 has. I think everyone else in this top 10 is an excellent player, but no one is really a great deck builder. And Nasif was. So he sets himself apart for that, but he is also, I think, a top 5 player just from the playing sense of things. In 4th place on my list, there's Luis Scott Vargas, LSV, a player from the United States with 10 Petit Top 8s and 1 win, and 16 GP Top 8s with 6 wins, as well as some recent results on the online tournaments as well. Much like Nasif, he has a couple Top 8s from those who aren't counted in. And Luis is not only one of the best players in history, he's also one of the most beloved players on the professional scene. I think he has a legion of fans, and I would say that he's actually the most popular Magic player ever. At least if you consider only Magic playing popularity, right? For example, it could be that Brian Killer is more popular than Luis, but Killer is popular because he's done other things. He's not popular only because of Magic, so it's hard to say how much of his popularity comes from his Hearthstone work, for example, or other work he's done. Luis is probably the most popular Magic player whose popularity comes strictly from Magic. And I think regardless of that, even if he wasn't as popular as he is, everyone will still have him in their top 5. I think it would be a pretty hard argument to exclude him from the top 5. In fact, I think the entire top 5 is pretty much set in stone as far as public opinion goes, at least among the high-level players. Everyone has the same top 5, but the order changes a little bit. So some people have Luis 4th, some people have him 5th, some people have him 3rd. Personally, I have him 4th. And the reason I have Luis in 4th place, specifically ahead of Nasif, is honestly because I think Luis is just a better player than Nasif is. I think, both players are phenomenally strong. This is not a dig at Nasif, who is an incredible player, but I think Luis is just better and has been better than Nasif throughout most of his career. And this comes from interacting with both of them. Right? I've obviously played a lot more with Luis than with Nasif. We were in the same team for a better part of a decade, even maybe more than a decade. So I know exactly how good he is, and he is very, very good. Nasif I haven't played with as much, but I've played against a lot, and I think even though a good player, he's slightly worse than Luis. So I would have Luis fourth. And Luis, I think, is a player that has the highs the Nasif does. So his best days are as good as Nasif's best days, but his worst days are not as bad as Nasif's. So I think his technical play in this regard is also better than mine. For example, I think his lows are higher than my lows and Nasif's lows. He doesn't make as many stupid mistakes as we do. And I think Luis's biggest strength among all the players is how good he is, in particular against worse opponents. Because he has this way of putting himself in their mind and manipulating their actions. So kind of like what Seth does to good players, right? Luis has the ability to do that with worse players. And obviously, it's something that we all do to an extent, but he will go to great lengths to make sure that his opponents are making the wrong play. So he knows exactly how much information he has to give to incentivize his opponents for making the wrong play. For example, sometimes he'll specifically leave up the wrong color of mana to cause a play from the opponent because he doesn't want the opponent to play around something. Sometimes he will specifically not play a land, so the opponent will think he's having mana problems and stuff like that. So it's in his range to do all this sort of things that manipulate the opponent, and he's extremely good at doing that. Also against good players, but in particular against less experienced players. I think that is this biggest skill set. In third place, we have the player who is, I think, not only one of the top 3 players of all time, but also the nicest, smartest, most intelligent, and most handsome Magic player in all of history, and that is Paolo Demon de Rosa, me. Yep, so I struggled with this for a while because obviously it feels pretty arrogant to just go and make a video. Oh, hey, here's the top 10 players of all time. Hey, there's me. How convenient. But so I consider not even including myself. But at the same time, I honestly believe I belong in this list, and I honestly believe I belong in this top 5 in particular. And I think any professional player, if they were to make this list, would also include my name. So it would be a lot of fake modesty if I weren't going to include myself. So this isn't really arrogance, it is just my honest opinion of where I believe I belong in the history of Magic. And I mean, I do have very good results. I have 16 PT top 8s with 2 wins. I have 24 GP top 8s with 2 wins. I have a Worlds win. I was Player of the Year. So I don't really lack for accolades to put myself in third. So yeah, I really do think I belong in this list. And hopefully you think so too. It's part of why you're watching my videos. But as far as playing strength goes, strengths and weaknesses, I already mentioned them a little bit, right? I think my biggest weakness is that I make very stupid mistakes. Very, very stupid mistakes very often. So if you've watched my matches or followed my career at all, you've no doubt seen a lot of awful mistakes that I've made that other players on this list don't make. So my low is very low. At the same time, I have an incredible grasp of strategy in general. So big picture stuff, I'm very, very good at that. So, for example, knowing when I have to attack, when I have to start blocking, when I have to be more defensive, figuring out what I have to do to win the game and how to get to a scenario where these things are possible. This is my strong suit. So this is what I'm good at, better than most people on this list. And the technical play, attacking the right land, attacking with the right creature, not doing something stupid is what I'm worst at in this list. So I think, hopefully I can improve and eventually climb my way to second or first. But right now, at this moment in time, I think I would put myself third. In second place, we have Kai Buddha. Kai is a German player who has 11 PT top 8s with 7 wins and 15 GP top 8s with 7 wins. He was also Player of the Year 4 times. Kai's numbers are honestly just absurd. Not the 11 PT top 8s part, even though that's still quite good. It would still put him in the top 5 by itself. But 7 wins is honestly mind-blowing. If you count I've mentioned 8 people so far, right? We're 8 people through our top 10. If you add up all of our wins in PTs, you get to 7, I believe. So combined, all the 8 players have as many wins as number 2 does. This is incredible, right? It is a little bit more now if you count the new events that aren't called PTs, but also count as PT top 8. So we might get to, 10 of those and beat Kai with our powers combined. But without those, we just tie him, and that's just an incredible statistic. I think this is a statistic that will never be matched, even if we consider every important tournament in the future a PT, it's still never going to be matched because 7 wins is so hard. And it's something that Kai was able to do because he was much better than the competition. That is just the reality of it, right? Kai was a 10 when everyone else was a 7. And nowadays, you might have some people who are 10s, but then you have a lot of people who are 9.5s, 9.3s, 9.1s. The average opponent is so much better and so many people are so good that it is impossible to have an edge as big as Kai did. So when Kai was the best player in the world, he was better than number 2 by enough that he just won everything, right? And I think this is what makes him second place. He was just better than his opposition by more than anyone will ever be better than their opposition ever again for as long as we play Magic. I don't believe it will ever be matched. This skill difference between first and second, this likelihood to win a tournament between first and second will never be matched. And in first place, as my choice for best player to have ever played Magic the Gathering, we have John Finkel. John is a player from the United States who has 16 PT top 8s with 3 wins and 10 GP top 8s with 3 wins as well. And on top of that, he is a Team World Champion and was also a Player of the Year. So his results really speak for themselves. They are incredible. All his metrics are incredible. His win rates across everything are extremely good. But most important, John was considered the best player in the world for a very, very, very long time. So before Kai came along, I think he was almost inarguably the best player in the world for many, many years. And this is something that everyone that played at that time agrees, that John was the best player in the world. If that was just it, I would still have Kai ahead of Finkel, because I think Kai was also the best player in the world for many years and was more dominant in his prime than Finkel ever was. Kai was more dominant than any single player will ever be in the history of Magic, including Finkel. The reason I have Finkel ahead of Kai is because of his longevity, his consistency, because Finkel left and then he came back and he still did extremely well. He still dominated even though he hadn't been playing Magic for many years. This is something incredibly impressive. And if you talk to the people who tested with Finkel for this, recent tournaments 1 year, 2 years ago, they will tell you that they think Finkel is the best player in the world. He's one of the best players in the world still, even though he's not a full-time player, even though he doesn't dedicate. And they will not say the same about Kai. It's the same people that tested with Finkel and Kai. Obviously, Kai is good, right? No one wins 7 Pro Tours without being good, but he's not as good now as he was before. And it is not a dig on him. He's not a full-time Magic player. He has a job. He has other interests, right? He doesn't have to be the best. He can settle for being very good, which is what he is. But Finkel, even though he had another full-time job, another career, he wasn't a full-time Magic player, he was still the best or one of the best. And this speaks to how much understanding of the game he actually has, his thought process, his way of thinking about things. He just understands more, thinks faster, and thinks better than anyone who's ever played the game, or at least that is, what I hear from everybody who interacts with him, and the results do back it up. Right, the results show me that he did extremely well. He came back, he continued doing well, even though he wasn't dedicating enough, which is why I have him first, because of this longevity, this fact that he was dominant in 2 very different periods of the game, and Kai was only dominant in 1, even though Kai was more dominant in my mind. So if we're talking best players in history, I think Finkel is the player that I have to choose as the most talented player to have ever played Magic and the most dominant across the history of Magic. That's it for today. Hopefully this video was still interesting, even though it's not exactly the type of video that I would usually do in this channel. And if you want to support my work a little bit more and get some extra perks on top of it, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR. And special thank you to my biggest supporters, Geoffrey Whitehead, Mattia Giardini, Thomas Pokorny, Lawson, and OCD. Hopefully I pronounced all your names correctly. Feel free to correct me if I haven't. But yeah, I really appreciate this support. And see you next week.